In December 2022, U.S. President Joe Biden welcomed dozens of African leaders for the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, in which he stated the U.S. is, quote, all in on Africa and all in with Africa. This was reaffirmed once again by Anteneh Blinken, U.S. Secretary of State, in his recent visit to Ethiopia this week, stating that the U.S. is committed to deep, responsive, and genuine partnerships on the continent. The Secretary of State on Wednesday also held talks with Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, announced a $331 million in new humanitarian assistance in Ethiopia, and attested that Ethiopia is on a promising path to peace. This latest visit is a sign of revitalization of U.S.-Ethiopia relations, which has a long and complex history. Now tried and now on a renewed path, the relationship between these two countries will be our topic of discussion for today. Hello and welcome to Diplomatic Insights. I am Kirana Baina. In today's episode, we will be looking into Blinken's visit to Ethiopia and the implications of the visit, as well as different dimensions of the relationship between the United States of America and Ethiopia. For the discussion today, I will be joined by Dr. Anteneh Getachew, who's a senior researcher at the Department of European and American Affairs at the Institute of Foreign Affairs. Do stay with us. Dr. Anteneh, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So when we look at the relationship between the United States and Ethiopia now, the United States has maintained diplomatic relationships with Ethiopia since 1903. And it has been based on what we call mutual interests in the past, although it has had its own ups and downs throughout time and more recently. But before I say much on that, I want you to take us through the trajectory of the United States and Ethiopia's relationship. What do these two countries really mean to each other?
We can raise many issues. It has been a long time, more than a century. First, the relation was started as in a form of trade relation in 1903 during the reign of Emperor Menelik, the first, the second. During that time, one thing attracted the emperor to just approach the country or Ethiopia as an emperor to America. One, that is that the U.S. has no colonial ambition at all, unlike many European countries. So, especially the triumph of Ethiopia, or the Battle of Adwa in 1896, have enhanced Ethiopia's diplomatic posture all over the world, particularly on the Western world, including U.S. That attracted U.S. leaders to have close ties with Ethiopian as a black nation that has defended its independence. So it starts in that way. But the diplomatic relation can be just made into a realistic way of diplomatic ties, especially during the reign of Emperor Haile Selassie, the Derg regime, then EPRDF, till the present, after the 2018 relation. So let me raise you some kind of ups and downs regarding these trajectories. The first one is, during the reign of Haile Selassie, it was the finest time of diplomatic relation between the two nations, especially during the time of President Eisenhower, and later during President John F. Kennedy. The emperor have paid a visit to the U.S. with the first black African leader, who have really had a very warm welcome in the State Department, especially in Washington, D.C. They have bilateral relations in that regard, that America is very much interested to have a control over its geopolitical interest in the region, and fortunately Ethiopia is found to be a stronger nation at the time. And really they have rented, leased the Kanyam Shalaka station, an intelligence station situated in Asmara, which was part of Ethiopia by then. That was really take into a different chapter, the relation between these two. In return, the U.S. also have paid much cost in establishing Ethiopians' pioneer institutions in Ethiopia, just like the Ethiopian Airlines or aviation industry and higher institutions and the like. Most of Ethiopians' pioneer government units have been established with great help and close help of the U.S. government by then. So, though the country still is geopolitically important in the Horn of Africa, the wise diplomats, our diplomatic genius by then, has also played a paramount role in making Ethiopia's diplomatic posture all over the global market, especially in the Western world like the U.S. And when there was a regime change, that means the military government takeover by coup d'etat, that is a Derg regime, completely that was have a relation. Even the international order has been changed. The state philosophy of the Ethiopian government was a socialist ideology that really makes some kind of crackdown in the diplomatic ties between the two nations. So there was a rift in diplomacy. Even that happens between the US government and Ethiopia during the Derg regime. The US doesn't completely abandon Ethiopia because it still believes that Ethiopia is have geostrategically important to serve the national interest of the West in general, because Ethiopia is traditionally going to be a natural ally to the West nations in general, Europe and America. Still, so they are not happy with what the government has done, especially the Derg regime in terms of human rights, democracy, and many domestic problems. If they are not happy, even if they, though they were not happy with that, they were also just giving their hands in terms of helping the people at risk during the drought and famine season in 1977 Ethiopian calendar and the like. So US still recognizes the importance, the vital importance of Ethiopia in the region. Then coming to the EPRDF era in 1991, that was the end of the Cold War, and the world, the international system has been changed from bipolar during the Cold War period into a monopolar world that is dominated by the United States of America. And the EPRDF was wise enough to calculate and to just make a close tie to the US. They recognize that without a close relation with us, they may not just consolidate their power, because they are coming to the center of the state power at the time. Especially the September 9/11 incidents really takes into a different chapter the relation, the diplomatic relation between the EPRDF government and the US. It just really changed into a different trajectory because of that terrorist attack. There was a strong relation. The global war on terror really makes EPRDF government to be a strategic ally to serve the interest of the US in fighting terrorism, Al-Shabaab and the like, which is found in a most volatile but geopolitically important corridor, one of the most important geopolitical corridor in our world, that is the Horn of Africa. So Ethiopia found to be a hegemon state by that time. Still, if there are some kind of debates in the literature, still I believe that Ethiopia is an anchor state because of different measures of national power. Still, Ethiopia is very much important. The US well understood this. Then comes the change, the 2018 political transformation in Ethiopia. Until then, the relation between US and Ethiopia was fine, but Ethiopia entered into a civil war in the north of the country. So that really the protracted nature of the war, the humanitarian atrocities out there, maybe the magnitude of ethnic violence, the internet displacement, all chaotic environment that happened, that surrounded the change, the political transformation happened in Ethiopia, really concerned the US. One thing, they believe that they have a value of serving the interest of the people, concerning about humanitarian atrocities. They believe that they can tolerate humanitarian crisis in one thing. The other one is they also very much concerned about their national interests in the region. If Ethiopia is not stable with 120 plus million people, if Ethiopia is not stable in the region, the whole region will be in chaos, the Horn Africa region. You know the case of Sudan, we know what is happening in Eritrea, Nairobi, the domestic problems, all. So it is really a very fragile but geopolitically important region. That is why they are very much concerned about to contain the Ethiopian domestic problem, especially the war. That makes really, we believe that created a diplomatic crackdown or rift between the two nations who have been allies, close allies for more than a century. Now things are making to re-engage again once with the US. Still, much of the work has not been done yet, but there are betterments in the diplomatic battle. There are betterments inside, but we'll see. We'll talk much later on with a different question with that.
Yeah, you're right. So talking about, the rift, and when you answer that question, something that I've noticed is there had been a lot of high-level visits between the United States and Ethiopia throughout history. And as we know in the diplomatic discourse, this kind of reciprocal high-level official visits is a way to forge or foster diplomatic relationship between two countries. And since we're saying that we're bouncing back from a rift in our relationship now, Blinken's trip to Ethiopia is one of the latest. We have recently seen Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed also take a trip to the United States. So in the face of this sort of revitalization of their relationship, what does this high-level visit mean right now?
Okay, that's good. If you remember, back before 2 months, I think, in Washington, there was a US-Africa Leaders Summit.
Yes.
And it is a national strategic document of Biden that was released in 2022. America, or the US Department, clearly stated that they want to innovate the relation with Africa. It's a kind of based on mutual, it is a kind of patron-client relationship, rather based on mutual interest and respect. And they want to change the political relation that has been depicted so far. Whenever we think of the US and African relation, mostly it is a humanitarian relation. It's offering humanitarian aid, political relation. Now they want to take into a kind of geo-economic relationship. America wants us to exploit the economic opportunities of the African market. Secretary Blinken's visit to Ethiopia is an extension of that. At the same time, there are other higher state officials visiting other African countries. So, for example, the Assistant Secretary, by this time, he's in South Africa. At the end of March, Vice President, Deputy President Kamala Harris will visit 3 African countries, Tanzania, maybe Zambia, and Ghana. So when just some kind of just putting things together, it gives another message. One, Blinken's visit. Ethiopia has signed, the Ethiopian government and the TPLF have signed a peace deal in Pretoria. Whether that is a cessation of hostilities deal, better to be termed in that way, for the time being at least. So they want to make sure that this peace has deep-rooted and that's really implemented well. What is the progress? They want to reassess and evaluate. If they have to be re-engage again in diplomatic terms, not only re-engagement, the Ethiopian government aspires more than that. It aspires more than re-engagement, reintegration to the extent of normalizing with the US. So for that, there are preconditions set and put by the US government. One is unfettered entrance of humanitarian aid to the affected areas, mostly to Tigray, Amhara, and Afar. That has been really going well. And maybe disarming the TPLF fighters and the like. I think there might be evaluation on that, so it might need further check-up whether that is really going on well or not. I don't have that much information, but there are things are really showing betterment through time. This makes the two nations to engage in diplomatic terms. So, but still, the US government, not only the US government, the West in general, including the European Union, has put other preconditions. If they are really genuine enough about to upgrade the relationship beyond engagement, they put maybe transitional justice has to be in place, and the other one is working to endow with accountability. The problem that may just have a hindrance that may hamper the re-engagement to a different chapter is that still Ethiopia is not out of from this ethnic conflict cycle. Still, we are very much invested much more on domestic and very much difficult problems that happened in our country. Really, if you are working to that, if you are just giving much focus what is going on in the region, in the Horn of Africa region, if our politicians, government officials, and our individual citizens who are really keen on to just about, who care about the sustainability of Ethiopian state, before they should give what is going on in the international system. The world is at risk now. There is power, superpower rivalry for a changing of a new global order. So this may affect our national interests, it may affect situations in the region at large. So we need to give much priority to that issues rather than the domestic issues. We don't have enough time to deal over about our domestic difference, political differences, economic differences, about money, power difference. So so our domestic stability, especially the effort that we put to bring Ethiopia out of this ethnic violence circle, might help us to put our diplomatic posture and foreign policy in the international arena to be very much visible and stronger than much before.
Yeah, so the importance of Ethiopia to the U.S. or their relationship is something that's undoubted. But regardless of that, as you said earlier, the U.S. saw itself as some kind of guardian regarding humanitarian causes. And before the U.S. normalizes its relations with Ethiopia, one thing that Blinken said was that the U.S. wants to see progress in peace and towards the implementation of the peace process. And again, throughout the 2 years, the U.S. had been very vocal in terms of bringing peace to Ethiopia, making sure that the conflict is done with and we go to normalcy. But now let's bring it to practicality. And is there something that the U.S. can do when it comes to the implementation process of this peace agreement? And if so, what is that role that it can play?
Of course, really they are very much serious and curious about the implementation of the peace deal. Not only the implementation of the peace deal, elsewhere in Ethiopia, in other parts of Ethiopia, still the situation is volatile.
Yeah.
Still, internal displacement is there, political, religious and ethnic conflict has been there. We are not out of this vicious circle. Yeah. One thing the government of Ethiopia should do is that it has to make sure that there is a complete state capture. You have to consolidate its power. It has to just catch the monopoly of violence. It has to put everything there, everywhere in the country. This is one thing. Otherwise, if you just make and change the peace deal into just well implemented properly in other part of the country, if a similar chaos happened, that also is adding a fuel into the fire. It's well they are really following up. So they are very much concerned about this precondition to be fulfilled. If the diplomatic re-engagement has to be entered into a new chapter, maybe to reintegration or normalization, they have already set the precondition. The Ethiopian government have the capacity to fulfill that preconditions, unless some of the preconditions might violate. If the government feels that it may just violate the national or compromise the national interest of the country, it is up to the incumbent to decide over that. But still, if there are also gaps in that way, bilaterally, the Ethiopian government or diplomats, the concerned ministry has to deal with that. Why? The Ethiopian government is retreating to accept this precondition. Have to be clear, and we have to work in diplomatic terms. This is the most important thing. But when it comes to AGOA, really it may have significant impact in terms of, especially it affects the small and micro enterprises down there. It affects really, it hurts, but it doesn't mean that that the US is not willing to lift these sanctions, but there are preconditions. They want to make sure that really, especially the war affected zones, people there has to be back to their normal life. Yes, peace building has to be there. Post-war reconstruction requires much effort in terms of economy, in terms of technical demand, in terms of expertise, in terms of institution capacity, in terms of maybe putting maybe accountability and transparency. These people also once again will be investing on post-war reconstruction. In post-war reconstruction, it's not only the government, rather many stakeholders, both the state and non-state actors will participate on that. So unless they are not, they can be sure that whether these progress are doing well on the ground as a concerned citizen, because they have their own national interest, they have accountability to their people, so they may take some time to bring back to a normalization or to back to the status quo of the diplomatic relation between the two nations. So what is happening in the ground matters. I think there are betterments very recently. The other one I should mention is about transitional justice. This is another condition, the preconditions that set by these governments. The Ethiopian government, I think, have drafted an ad hoc committee a temporal ad hoc committee to draft a transitional justice policy. In one of its discussion forums, I was part of that last week. So there are that ad hoc committee is gathering expertise, ideas, and opinions how we can set up a transitional justice policy for Ethiopia. These things might help. That is why really they're also really just begun to release their financial aid. It is even also when you are making good relations with the US bilaterally, the multilateral organizations like the IMF and the World Bank will have also set their own criteria, their own preconditions. So it is the responsibility of the incumbent government to set which precondition violates Ethiopian national interest and which can go along with Ethiopia's national interest. It is the duty of that. So if any precondition, if that is not going to violate the national interest of Ethiopia, you can abide by that, and you can do, and you can just get what you are going to get in terms of financial aid, humanitarian, but still the door is open. And one important thing that the US once again recognized that Ethiopia is very much important to serve the national interest of the US, and it is a strategic ally to the US still.
Speaking of the relationship and the importance that we have throughout time, now we're seeing a change in sort of the global world order, and we're seeing more calls for African representation, also a change in the tone of the relationship between different African countries and global powers, let's call them. And now the United States officials have been on a mission to kind of show that Washington is not only looking towards being the donor for Africa's, humanitarian needs, but wants to be a partner. So now, as a conclusion and very briefly, let's look at how Ethiopia can make the most out of this revitalized interest of Washington to change its approach to Africa.
That's good. One thing that we should not forget is that every country has its own national interest to serve. It has an accountability to its people. So whenever we just calculate our national interest, we have to equally recognize the national interest of other states also. One thing, especially at this time, the problem is there is great superpowers power rivalry in the making of a new global order. That global order is manifested itself in different ways. A competition in terms of trade, economy, finance, technology with China. The Ukraine-Russia war is one manifestation that the changing of the global order is imminent. Who going to shape that new global order? Probably we can put some kind of analysis, and it might take much effort to do that. But still, the status quo will not continue like this. The world either will be changed into bipolar order, or maybe changed into a multipolar order. So Ethiopia's diplomatic effort should be how Ethiopia could navigate in such chaotic world system to serve its national interest first, without affecting or much damaging the interest of others. Ethiopian foreign policy for long is non-alignment. We are not going to side any power. Our fundamental point to just for our foreign policy is our national interest. With China, with appropriate ways, we can just do our diplomatic efforts. With the US and the West in general, we can make the same thing. It doesn't mean that approaching to US doesn't mean that abandoning or distancing China or Russia. We do have our national in different modalities. Not only bilaterally, we do have also multilateral forums that Ethiopia wants to serve its national interests. It had been there in the diplomatic history of Ethiopia. So we have to be careful sometimes. We should not just really approach to one block and distancing the other. So I think the concerned ministry really is well doing on it, I think, and experts also will contribute on that, and the incumbent government, I hope, is aware of this. So it is a time that countries, especially developing countries, has to be careful, because the situation, the international, the new global order, the changing in new global order is putting developing countries into a kind of dilemma. Foreign policy dilemma, security dilemma, because which side to ally with is very much dangerous, and very much has to be done with much thought and much critical thought without affecting one's national interest.
All right, Dr. Anteneh, thank you very much for your insights and for your time today. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much too.
And on that note, we end today's Diplomatic Insight. We've looked at the new revitalized relationship between the United States and Ethiopia, and also the recent visit from U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. I was Kirana Baina leading you through the program. Until next time.